Heavy rains impacting over 50 cities and counties in China. One river's water level rose a whopping 13 feet in a day. Even more rain is expected. China's new National Anthem Law set to take effect in Hong Kong this week, despite strong opposition from Hong Kong legislators. More on the controversy. Residents in a Taiwanese city voted to remove their mayor from office. It's the first time in history over 900,000 showed up to vote. China threatens to pull the plug of a UK nuclear power plant and retaliate against a UK bank if the UK moves to block Huawei. Meanwhile, the Chinese tech company is already struggling with new sanctions from the US. And a former director general of the WHO weighs in on the debate surrounding Beijing's virus response. She says she's not sure if the regime deliberately covered it up, but if they did, it would be nothing new. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The U.S. is tightening restrictions on semiconductor manufacturers that use American machinery or software. A new roadblock issued by the Commerce Department now bans chip makers from using U.S. technology to produce chips for Chinese tech firm Huawei. It was a major blow to China's telecom giant. China had previously set a goal to produce 70% of its semiconductors by 2025. If achieved, it will greatly reduce China's dependence on the U.S. But U.S. market research firm IC Insights says it won't be an easy task for Beijing. Last year, only about 15% of the chips used by Chinese factories were produced in China. It's a slight increase, about 0.5% from data collected 5 years ago. Likewise, IC Insights forecasts that China's domestic chip production will only reach about 20% by 2024. Heavy rains are drenching southern China. According to local media, about 50 cities and counties have been impacted. The water level of one river even rose a whopping 13 feet a day. Even more rain is expected for the coming week. The downpour comes as temperatures blazed over Beijing on Monday, reaching a high of over 100 degrees. In other areas of northern China, temperatures even broke 104 degrees. China's new National Anthem Law is set to take effect in Hong Kong this week. It stipulates that anyone who deliberately and politically insults the country's national anthem will face up to 3 years in jail. Hong Kong's pro-democratic legislators strongly oppose the law. They say the law's definition of the term insult is too vague. Changes to anthem lyrics or even audiences booing when the anthem is played at sporting events may now be considered a violation of the law. Many argue the rule's passing further suppresses the freedom of speech inside the city. One of the anthem's lyrics is translated as "Arise, ye who refuse to be slaves." Bringing the phrase into question, one netizen asked, when protesters and oppressed people are singing national anthem to the CCP's tyranny government, is it a violation of the law or upholding the law? A headline from an issue of the Chinese newspaper Europe Times is attracting attention. On the front page of the paper's Central and Eastern European version, the headline reads, 30 million Hong Kongers support the national security law, referring to Beijing's recent and highly controversial Hong Kong law. But there's a problem. Hong Kong only has a population of 7.5 million. This Chinese newspaper is known to be pro-Beijing. The so-called national security law is widely considered to be another crackdown on Hong Kong's autonomy and freedom. It also threatens the city's status as international financial center. For the first time ever, residents in one Taiwanese city voted to remove their mayor from office last weekend. Over 900,000 voters from one city supported the decision, far surpassing the 575,000 vote requirement. The city has a population of close to 3 million. The result was seemingly motivated by two factors. First, the new former mayor is Beijing-friendly and seeks to build closer ties with China's communist regime. Unhappiness among Taiwanese citizens towards the regime has been on the rise, not only due to its suppression of freedom in Hong Kong, but also because of its efforts to block Taiwan from joining the World Health Organization. Second, the former mayor took leave from his office to run for president. But during his campaign for mayor, he promised voters that he wouldn't seek Taiwan's presidency. British newspaper The Times reports that British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is preparing to implement new, tougher laws designed to prevent foreign takeovers that pose risks to national security. This comes amid increasing concerns over the Chinese regime's influence after the UK designated telecoms giant Huawei as a high-risk vendor in January. Johnson is pushing for legislation to make it mandatory for companies to report attempted takeovers. According to the draft bill, companies would need to report when foreign firms plan to buy 25% or more of shares, assets, or intellectual property. He also reportedly wants to include academic partnerships and research projects under the rules. If passed, the law would be backed by the threat of criminal sanctions. Those who fail to report could face jail time or face hefty fines. The UK is taking a tougher stance on China amid the pandemic and after Beijing passed its controversial bill on Hong Kong. Foreign Affairs Select Committee Chairman Tom Tugendhat drew up 5 strategies to deal with China. He says the UK needs a global China strategy to confront what he calls the biggest challenge to the liberal world since the end of the Cold War. He pointed out the risk that Chinese students studying in the UK pose as political tools. He said more than a third of UK's international students hail from China. Such dependence, he points out, puts pressure on some British universities. He says it's the responsibility of the state to reduce that pressure, adding that students who pose threats should face the risk of being expelled. He also suggested the UK's foreign student body should be diversified, which would lessen the reliance on Chinese students. The other 4 points include protecting companies from foreign takeovers, diversifying trade so as to rely less on China, neutralizing China's Belt and Road Initiative to reintroduce international trade, and leading electronic independence, pointing out that distancing from Chinese telecom giant Huawei is only the beginning. He also added that the UK still needs to develop its own systems to help others grow and innovate. The battle between the British government and China's 5G provider is ramping up. China threatened to retaliate if UK blocks Chinese company Huawei. The tech company is already in survival mode after new sanctions from the United States.
Britain's dispute with China over Huawei is escalating, and China is raising the stakes for Britain. On Sunday, The Telegraph reported that British investment bank HSBC is now lobbying the UK government not to block Huawei from the country's 5G network. HSBC reportedly said if the Chinese telecom giant is blocked in the UK, the London-based bank may face retaliation from the Chinese regime. According to a Bloomberg report, over a third of HSBC's global revenue comes from Hong Kong and mainland China. Several UK and US lawmakers called out the bank last week for supporting a controversial Beijing law. Experts say the law would destroy Hong Kong's freedom. China has also threatened to pull the plug on the new British nuclear plant, where Chinese investment accounts for a third of the project. The UK has previously allowed Huawei a limited role in building 5G, but recently reversed course. The UK's intelligence agency launched an emergency security review on Huawei late last month, which could lead to a complete ban of the company. Last week, Prime Minister Boris Johnson approved a plan to work with Britain's Five Eyes intelligence partners to build Western alternatives to Huawei. Other members of the alliance are the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. The 5 countries have either banned or are working to remove Huawei from 5G after US officials repeatedly sounded the alarm.
Huawei and other Chinese state-backed tech companies are Trojan horses.
Huawei denies the accusations, but all Chinese companies and citizens are required by law to provide intelligence the regime asks for. The Trump administration has moved to block global chip supplies to Huawei. Huawei says the new ban threatens its survival. The chips it stocked up can last only until the end of the year. Washington previously asked Canada to arrest and extradite Huawei's Vancouver-based CFO Meng Wanzhou. Meng was accused of selling sanctioned goods to Iran and deceiving US banks into clearing transactions for Huawei's Iran business. In its latest bid to push through public pressure, Huawei is now launching an advertising blitz in the UK. On Monday, the company bought full-page ads in several British national newspapers, saying it's as committed as ever to provide the UK's 5G networks, even though some now question their role. Reporting by Penny Joe, NTD News.
More reports that China is an untrustworthy partner in the fight against the virus. A former director general of the World Health Organization says she's not sure if Beijing deliberately covered up the virus outbreak. But if they did, it would be nothing new.
The World Health Organization's former director general questions whether China's cover-up of the virus outbreak was deliberate. She says there was no doubt China wanted to cover up the SARS epidemic in 2003. Gro Harlem Brundtland was Prime Minister of Norway for 3 terms and co-chaired an independent monitoring body for global health crises. In an interview with Germany's news magazine Der Spiegel, she lists 3 main reasons to criticize China's response to the virus outbreak that has caused a months-long global pandemic. In her words, the response was too slow, and they informed the world too late. But worst of all, she said, Beijing did not acknowledge that the infection could pass from person to person until 19 days after it was already clearly discernible. She said from the initial outbreak, experts at the WHO were trying to get more information out of China, an all too familiar experience for Brundtland. She was Director General of the WHO when the highly contagious respiratory illness, later named SARS, first appeared in November 2002 in Guangdong, China. She said the WHO was given excuses by Beijing and turned away for weeks in an effort to cover up the epidemic. Republican Senator Rick Scott, speaking on BBC's Andrew Marr show on Friday, said he can't give an instance where Communist China has tried to be a great partner to the rest of the world. He said the U.S. intelligence community has evidence that Beijing is trying to sabotage or slow down Western development of a vaccine, deciding to be an adversary to Americans and to democracy around the world. And if Communist China creates a CCP virus vaccine first, he says he's certain they won't share it with the West.
And tensions between China and Australia remain high. Australia says Beijing is ignoring calls for diplomatic trade talks after Canberra voiced support for an investigation into the virus's origin.
Australian Trade Minister Simon Birmingham says China remains unresponsive to Australia's weeks-long pleas to ease trade tensions between them. Canberra had earlier called for an international inquiry into the origins of the CCP virus, prompting the strain. The Chinese regime later accused Australia of playing petty tricks and threatened that Chinese consumers could boycott Australian products if Australia pursued the inquiry. China has since suspended beef imports from 4 of Australia's largest meat processors and imposed hefty tariffs on barley, though both sides say it's unrelated to the spat. Birmingham has been requesting discussions with his Chinese counterpart for weeks, but he said Beijing has been ignoring Canberra's pleas. China did not deny the comment. Australia says the virus most likely originated in a wildlife market in the city of Wuhan, but the country insists that the call for an independent investigation into the pandemic is not politically motivated. A poll from the newspaper The Australian on Monday showed 79% of Australians backed a global investigation.
New York City is taking baby steps toward reopening. Part of Phase 1, hundreds of thousands of people went back to work today. But it's still unclear how and when the economy will rebound.
It's been a little over 3 months since New York State confirmed its first coronavirus case. And here in New York City, it's the last region to reopen, and now they're starting Phase 1 of reopening. That means that retail stores can start offering curbside pickup. But as you can see, it doesn't look like many of them are starting to do that just yet. Here in Times Square, there seems to be a little bit more movement than normal, but it's not the regular hustle bustle that you would see. So from what we're seeing, it's going to be a while before the city returns to normal again.
Maybe a year, I hope less.
Virus cases have gone down over the past couple of weeks. Some days even as low as 100 to 300 new cases per day, a number that was once at 6,300 positive cases in a day.
Hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers overall coming back today to work in the 5 boroughs.
Even with this step forward, people are still uncertain about the economic recovery. Mayor de Blasio is projecting a $9 billion loss in tax revenue this year.
We'll have to save some money because we don't know what will happen tomorrow.
Even though they're going to open up some of these businesses, you still got a lot of people that's out here that ain't going to have no jobs when they do open back up.
Like his friend who owns a barbershop in Brooklyn. His business isn't included in Phase 1, so he can't reopen yet. And he says even when he can, it will take a while to climb out of the financial hole the pandemic has caused.
You got to catch up with the bills. Once you do that, you got to go into advertisement, bring the customers back.
That and even more to worry about for the businesses that have been victims of looters. A lot of problem solving to be done for New Yorkers as they start on the road to recovery. Reporting from New York, Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
De Blasio also said the city would get 20 more miles of bus lanes to help alleviate overcrowding on public transportation. Today, you can put 39 states and 5 countries back on your list of travel options. The Pentagon recently lifted restrictions on them because they meet certain criteria. The countries include Germany, Japan, and the UK. The restrictions, of course, were put in place to try and limit the spread of the virus. But the Pentagon said the decision was based on 3 things. First, shelter-in-place orders being lifted in those areas. Second, fewer and fewer people with flu and virus-like symptoms over the course of 2 weeks. And third, fewer new virus cases or positive tests over 2 weeks. But some states still haven't met those requirements, including California, Florida, and North Carolina. And in New Zealand, the Prime Minister says the country has officially eradicated CCP virus and will go back to normal, now that the last known infected person has recovered.
New Zealand welcomed the news that there are no active cases of the coronavirus for the first time since the virus arrived in the country in late February. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said Monday her country will lift all containment measures except for border restrictions beginning at midnight.
Not only have we protected New Zealanders' health, we now have a head start on our economic recovery.
And when asked how she celebrated the milestone, she answered,
"I did a little dance."
The news sets New Zealand on course to eliminate the disease from its shores and open up its economy. That's largely thanks to 7 weeks of a strict lockdown, where businesses were shut and all but essential workers stayed home. Now she's calling for collective action to unite for the country's economic recovery, encouraging people to buy local products and support local businesses to get them back on their feet. In total, New Zealand reported 22 deaths and more than 1,000 cases among its 5 million population. The country's Ministry of Health said Monday the last person being monitored for the disease had recovered. But officials are cautious about claiming victory. Ardern warned that elimination of the virus does not mean permanent eradication. For New Zealand, it will indicate 28 days of no so-called chains of transmission, which would fall on June 15.
U.S. stocks rose today, with the Nasdaq hitting a new high after a surprisingly encouraging jobs report last week. Here's more in today's Business Briefs.
Wall Street continued to climb on Monday as the jobs report last Friday bolstered hope for a swift recovery. The Nasdaq hit a record close, gaining 110 points or 1.1%. The Dow adds 461 points or 1.7%. The S&P 500 is up 38 points or 1.2%. The energy sector climbed the most as major oil producers agreed over the weekend to extend a deal on output cuts. Shares of U.S. oil refiners rebounded on Monday. Wall Street's betting on a strong recovery, even though demand for gasoline, jet fuel and diesel remains well below seasonal lows. Shares of Valero and Marathon were trading at their highest levels since the first week of March. Dunkin' Donuts said on Monday its franchises are seeking to hire up to 25,000 workers as it prepares for the higher demand with states reopening. About 90% of Dunkin's restaurants are now open. New jobs include front-of-counter to managerial roles at restaurants. BP will cut 10,000 workers, or about 15% of its workforce, in response to the CCP virus crisis and as part of its plan to move to renewable energy. The British company said on Monday those affected will be mostly senior office-based positions and not frontline operational staff. About 1/5 of the jobs cut will be in Britain.
The virus is changing history in more ways than one. Damsels and knights at a French medieval amusement park are adapting to modern safety measures so they can go back in time again.
France's second largest theme park is putting on the final touches before reopening to the public. The Puy de Fou's 6,200 staff, including 4,000 volunteers, have been preparing from home under lockdown.
We all can't wait to see our audience again.
The park's president says visitors can go back in time while maintaining modern social distancing guidelines.
We are very confident about welcoming our visitors in the best conditions.
Though they didn't have to do social distancing in medieval times, today's damsels and knights are adapting for the stage.
All of the choreography has been modified, meaning when Marguerite is strangled in one scene before Joan of Arc comes to save her, all that physical contact was totally reworked.
Costumes will also adapt, couturiers resewing costumes to add masks or facial coverings. The Puy du Fou Park relives battles, legends and myths from the Middle Ages. It had 2.3 million visitors last year, but this month visitors are limited to 7,000.
Here at China in Focus, we dedicate ourselves to bringing you truthful, unbiased reporting. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the latest updates, and see you tomorrow.